Hi, good afternoon. I'm Kate Jacobson, the History Coordinator of the Ramsey County Public Library, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to the popular ongoing presidential series created by historian J.B. Andersen. Today's talk is the fifth in the series, focusing on James Madison, our fourth president. Today's program is brought to you through the Ramsey County Libraries and our co-sponsorship with the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute of the University of Minnesota. We're deeply grateful to be able to both of these organizations to be able to bring this program to you. So without any further ado, I'm going to turn things over to our speaker, J.B. Andersen.
I'm in a different place today. I'm at the library. My system at home wasn't working. My Xfinity box just was not coming on, so I had no internet connection. So I've been going like crazy trying to figure that out with Grayson, and finally got in my car and drove to the Maplewood Library near where I live. And they've gotten me all set up. And this happens to be where Kay Jacobson works at this branch. So that's the reason the background's different. And I look a little different here, maybe, because I'm on a laptop computer. So anyway, I've been going at super speed, light years, so I'm gonna try to slow down, talk easy, etc. So thanks for your patience. Today we are going to talk about James Madison again. I'm going to open with a quote from Madison on church and state relationships. The purpose of separation of church and state is to keep forever from these shores the ceaseless strife that has soaked the soil of Europe in blood for centuries. Second thing I'd like to talk to you about is how to listen to a lecture. This is a little handout that I've picked up. People coming when we would meet in person could grab them off a table. So I'd like to go over it very quickly here. And since there's been no way to hand it out to you in person. So here are some things you can do when listening to a lecture. The most interesting fact I learned today. So, end of the lecture, say, gee, that part was interesting. How about an idea that you heard today? Also, any open-ended questions, we'll have questions and answers at the end of the lecture. Anything in class today raised by me or other classmates, leaving messages or in your own thoughts. Number 4, relate an item in class to a personal experience if possible. This is helping you in thinking, remembering things, etc. And of significance also is relating historical events to current times. So in the next 2 lectures, I'm going to be talking about problems that Madison had and problems that we see today that are related, similar, things like that. So good. Way to remember this is the mnemonic called FIOPECT, F-I-O-P-E-C-T. F is for fact, I is for idea, O is for open-ended question, P-E is for personal experience, and C-T is for current times. Okay, Madison. Today we're going to talk about the major event of the Madison presidency and one of the major events in U.S. history. That was our second war with England, the War of 1812. It's occurring about 30 years after the American Revolution. First thing we're going to talk about is who were the combatants in the War of 1812. And they were the United States and Great Britain. But directly north of us is Canada. It's not a country yet. It's really a part of Britain. So Canada, of course, sided with Great Britain. Canada was full of British soldiers. Native Americans, they were located in Canada. They were located in the United States. They sided with both sides. And it wasn't just based on where your living land was located. It was often based on politics also. So you had Native Americans who technically were in what would become a part of the United States who sided with Britain, and vice versa. Some Native Americans north of our border who sided with the United States. So this is the second big war, the American Revolution, now the War of 1812, between the United States and Great Britain. 4 reasons for the war. I gotta take my phone off so I can see a clock. Thank you. 4 reasons. Britain had just had a lengthy war with France. France was in its revolution beginning in the early 1790s. Britain looks at France and it goes, okay, you got infighting in France. You got common folk killing off the king, the queen, other members of nobility. They're in a lot of trouble in France. A perfect time to invade them and take them over. So Britain started the 4 policies that we're going to look at here that led to war with the United States. So just coming off of this lengthy war with France. Britain had straight trade restrictions with France. The United States, however, had no such restrictions. We were trading with both countries. As you are aware, this was an economic and a political issue. The Democrats at the time, made up of Jefferson and as a major spokesman, really wanted the United States to be identifying with France. They helped us during the American Revolution. They sent us the Marquis de Lafayette. They sent lots of naval vessels. And a lot of people said, Britain, we fought them. We gained independence from them. Why do we want to be a part of them? Other people more interested in economics said, no, we want to trade with both of these countries. So the first major item was trade. And the United States was trading with both Britain and France at the time. The US was neutral in this British and French war. We never sent troops supporting either side in France. Britain was our old enemy. We didn't take sides. So trade was allowed. We weren't at war. We could trade with any country that we wanted. But there was lots of tension as a result of these difficulties between Britain and France, and within the United States, differing groups that wanted us to side with France, other groups that wanted us to side with Britain. 1802 to 1810, United States, this is just, the end of this is just 2 years before the War of 1812 starts. During this 8 to 9 year period, 1802 to 1810, US trade with Britain doubled. This is a fantastic increase. 80% of all the cotton grown in the United States went to Britain. This was cotton being grown under slave labor in southern states. 50% of all US trade was with Britain. So we talk about the industrial North, New England, being more like England itself because they were both industrial countries. Yet, look at this, agriculturally throughout the South, 80% of the cotton grown in the South is traded to Great Britain. One of the major problems, second issue here, is impressment. And this was something British ships did. So you had ships at sea. The United States didn't have very many ships, but private industries within the United States did. Now, Britain would be out patrolling the Atlantic Ocean and had engaged in difficulties with France on other ships. Some of the sailors on board the British ships were killed or maimed to a point where they could no longer do their jobs. The British military ship said, hey, we need to replace these 4 guys, or however many it was. So they'd see some ship, like a US privately owned ship sailing. They'd get next to it and say, we need 4 of your guys, and we're taking them. This was called impressment. Today we call it kidnapping. At any rate, here is a drawing of a British warship leading private sailors from a US ship on a board from their home ship to do forced service, forced labor on board the British warship. Britain said that these people were all deserters from Britain, and that's why we're taking them. So they were trying to justify this as being something that they had every right to do. We stopped trade with Britain as a result. They were kidnapping soldiers off US privately owned ships. The big issue was impressment. We're stopping trade with you because of what you're doing with sailors on board private ships. US diplomats used the term kidnapping, which was a far more negative term than is impressment. The British did not stop it, however. US starts this battle cry, free trade and sailors' rights. So free trade is what they wanted. We can trade with any country we wish, and you leave our private sailors alone. And this would not be any free trade would mean you can trade with any country you want by taking in their imports and by getting them to buy our exports. Third major reason, British were supplying Native Americans, especially, they weren't supplying Native Americans that were in the United States yet, but they were in US territories. They were around the Great Lakes, and the British started supplying these Native Americans with arms and with goods like clothing, blankets, food, etc. So the British are getting Native Americans to side with them. So the US starts to feel threatened here in US territories to the south of the Great Lakes. The British are influencing and arming Native Americans to fight against us. To get a graphic for that previous slide, I typed in arms, as in armaments. Guess what? This is what I got. Arnold Schwarzenegger. US territorial expansion is the 4th item, and this is territorial expansion into Canada. The British were very concerned that the US had a purpose, and that was to take over Canada, much of Canada at any rate, and so they wanted to protect Canada. Canada actually became independent and a country on its own when the US invaded it after the Civil War in 1867. And there were battles there. And actually, it wasn't the US that invaded it. It really was a militia group of US soldiers. And the whole thing, Canada created itself as a nation and no longer or giving it more power than just simply being associated with Britain. Historians up until 1940 generally listed the major cause of war as a concern about US expansion into Canada. The British were concerned about this because they controlled Canada. Look at Oregon Territory here in the black box. I'm sorry, I don't have a cursor that shows up on this laptop, so I can't point out to you, but you can see that darkened in area. The United States called that Oregon Territory, and they said we own it all. By the time we get to 1840, we're talking about 1812 here. So, you know, this is almost 30 years later. The battle cry during the campaign of 1840 was 54-40 or fight. And everything, almost everything within that black box, the US was claiming. We would have owned land all the way up to present day Alaska. However, a compromise was made with the British Canadians. And the expansion toward Canada after the negotiations ended because we established the current border by treaty. So you can see here, there's a black line, and that current border runs from Lake of the Woods in Minnesota all the way to the Pacific Ocean. And that line was drawn as a result of a treaty. So we gave up claims to all of that far western Canada territory that today is British Columbia and stretches up toward Alaska. Reports and a letter of Madison and his cabinet. Here's what they showed. They talked about conquest of Canada regularly in written letters that survive to this day. They did not see Canada as a bargaining chip. You know, hey, okay, we'll back off of claims in Canada if you give us thus and such. See, so it's not a bargaining chip. They really wanted these high-ranking US officials from Madison to his cabinet and onward, wanted a real invasion of Canada. They wanted to take over much of that territory, as is shown in written documents from the time period. Conquest of Canada would be easy, according to many of these letters and diaries that people had written. This same reason was given for the invasion of Iraq in 2002, ended up lasting 7 years. Now, applying this to the present day, look at the Russia and Ukraine war. Russia thought they'd conquer Ukraine in about 3 days. Well, here we are into the second year. So this calculations about the ability to conquer something and in what amount of time, the fallacy has not gone away. Canada provided lots of food to England. It was a huge export area. They had great growing area. If trade stopped with Canada, it would really hurt Britain. So Britain was very much in favor of protecting Canada, due primarily to the food resources that it was able to receive. Third item under this fourth reason is conquest of Canada could be a bargaining chip. We've talked about that already. Could be a bargaining chip at a treaty conference, and hopefully at a treaty conference, we might get more of Canada, even though we wouldn't get all of what it was that we wanted. Here are Native Americans with guns, rifles, or muskets, and Britain provided lots of goods, as I mentioned earlier, to the Native Americans in order to make those Native Americans into allies. This was being done not so much to protect Canada, but to keep the United States from expanding even further westward. By the time the War of 1812 started, we had already done the Louisiana Purchase 9 years earlier, and we now claimed all the land as far west as the Mississippi River and beyond even. So this was an issue for Britain. We don't want US expansion to move beyond where it currently is. So this War of 1812, you can see there's lots of reasons for it building. Trade reasons, arming Native Americans within US territory, stopping expansion, what about the invasion of Canada, so on. US capitalism would extend Canada and destroy the British aristocracy. This is a worry in Britain. Britain had a more controlled economy. It had lots of monopolies like the East India Company. You are a business in Britain. You are the only people that can do business with India. No other companies can. Under US capitalism, we'd have 6 or 16 countries trying to make deals with India. But Britain was different. It allowed its aristocracy to create companies, and these companies then would get total control over trade with a certain area that Britain had conquered. United States finally declares war on Britain due to the arming of Native Americans in large part. And that occurred on June 18th of 1812. That's the day my wife and I got married. It wasn't in 1812 though. Presidency of James Madison, the War of 1812. We're going to take a look at New England because it had quite a controversial reaction to the War of 1812. New England is the northeastern part of the United States. Here's a map of the 5 states that make up New England. And let's start at the top there, find New Hampshire. And to your left is Vermont. To the south of New Hampshire and Vermont is Massachusetts. And to the south of Massachusetts is Connecticut and Rhode Island. Now, Maine is not a state yet. It's not a state till 1820. And here's a close-up of these New England states and territories. Massachusetts pretty much ran the territory of Maine before it became a state. So in 1812, Massachusetts is controlling that area that today is the state of Maine. And so the 5 states that we talked about earlier there are New England. So when we say New England, we're talking about New Hampshire, Vermont, Connecticut, Massachusetts, and Rhode Island. New England suffered a great deal because of war with Britain and the War of 1812. There was lots of trade with Britain, especially out of New England. And this is kind of what we've concentrated on with the War of 1812. Don't mention the South much, but the South, as I stated earlier on a slide, 80% of the cotton it grew was traded to Britain. So the South had some concerns also. But New England, they said, we're not going to pay any expenses for this war because this war is hurting us. We can't trade with Great Britain anymore. So they refused to pay any state monies into the federal government in order to pay for the War of 1812. Next thing we're going to talk about, continuing with New England and the war, we're going to talk about the Hartford Convention. And this was a convention about New England where they discussed secession of these 5 states that are known as New England. They did not proclaim it. They talked about it only. And they created this logo that you see there, New England Independence, meaning independence from the United States. And their symbol became the pine tree and this map of New England that included the territory of Maine. States are sovereign over the federal government. Sorry, something went wrong with that slide. Anyway, the Hartford Convention now, which is these New England states, its first declaration is states have sovereignty over the federal government. So they're arguing for states' rights. And this is Northern Territory, but it's 1812 also. Madison stated the same thing in 1798. This is, 15 years roughly before the War of 1812. A lot of these statements that he was making as a cabinet member during George Washington administration is now being used against him because he was siding with states' rights. Now he wants money from the states to aid in paying for the War of 1812. So the Hartford Convention and these 5 New England states called for 5 constitutional amendments, and we're going to take a look at those. Any federal trade embargoes must be 60 days or less. What this means is they can't last very long. They can't hurt New England trade for very long. So amend the Constitution. We are dependent on trade. You want to have an embargo against some other country, meaning we can't trade with them. It's got to be 60 days or less. 2/3 majority in Congress. The Hartford Convention says you need a 2/3 majority in order to declare war, not a simple majority of 50%. Want to admit a new state to the Union? You need a 2/3 vote of Congress. You want to ban foreign trade that would really hurt those of us in New England? You need a 2/3 vote in Congress. So they're making it more difficult with this constitutional amendment to declare war, admit new states, and ban foreign trade. Item 3, remove the 3/5 clause. The 3/5 clause was Southern slave states. And they said, hey, the House of Representatives is based on population. We have this huge population of slaves. We want them counted. Well, they couldn't vote, neither could women, but they said, we think you should count these slaves as population, and that'll give us more representatives in the House of Representatives. The compromise that was reached in the Constitution was that all slaves would be counted as 3/5 of a person. So let's say you've got 10,000 slaves in your state. You get 6,000 more residents to add to your population, which is 3/5 of 10,000. You get 6,000 more people in your state, and that at the time there were about 30,000 people in each congressional district. Well, with the numbers of slaves in the South, they were greatly able to increase the number of representatives that they had in the House of Representatives. So this New England Hartford Convention says you got to get rid of that. That's an ugly provision. It gives these southern states more power, especially in the House of Representatives, than they deserve. I typed in clause to search for a graphic of the 3/5 clause, such as you see here. This is what I got. So, item number 4, they wanted to limit presidents to a single term. You could only serve 4 years. We did not get a limit on presidential terms until the early 1950s. Late 1940s, it was starting to be negotiated. Came primarily from Republicans who were very concerned about Franklin Roosevelt, who didn't stick to the tradition of serving only 2 terms. In 1944, he was elected to a 4th term. Republicans became very nervous about that. So they got a constitutional amendment passed, limits the president to 2 terms. They exempted Harry Truman, who was the sitting president at the time of the introduction of this amendment to the states. So Harry Truman could have run for president as many times as he wanted. He chose not to run again after a 2nd term in 1952. Eisenhower ran and became president. This is interesting as kind of a side note. The Republicans really shot themselves in the foot. I mean, Reagan's dead and he'd probably still be president. Same thing, you know, there are other Republican presidents who were very popular and may well have lasted more than 2 terms. Succeeding presidents must be from different states than their predecessor. This is another thing that New England talked about at the Hartford Convention and wanted to propose as an amendment to the Constitution. We are on the 4th president here, Madison. 3 of the first 4 presidents were from Virginia. John Adams was from Massachusetts. Washington, Jefferson, and Madison were all from Virginia. One state's getting a lot of power at the federal level. We want that to stop. If the current president is from Virginia, the next president cannot be from Virginia. So succeeding presidents must be from a different state than their predecessor. Of the 45 men who have been president, 8 are from Virginia, 7 from Ohio, 4 from New York, 4 from Massachusetts. That's a total of 23 presidents from just 4 states. That's 48% of all the presidents are from just these states here, 8% of the states. States that produce the most presidents, actually, these are states that produce the only presidents. And you can see Virginia has 8, Ohio 7, California 1. Look at all the states. I mean, there's a majority of states that have not had a president serve from them. But Georgia in the South there, that's Jimmy Carter. Arkansas, that's Clinton. So you can see the East has pretty well controlled the presidency. However, the East has been around a lot longer than the West also. Virginia 8, Ohio 7, New York 4, Massachusetts 4. Slave states, there's been 17 presidents. from slave states. That's 34% of all the presidents of the United States have been from slave states. Eastern states have been around far longer. I mean, they started out at the beginning, 1776, and the Midwestern states, the Western states didn't exist yet. So now, how do you decide what state a president's from? Is it the state that they were born in? Is it the state they grew up in, which could well be different? Or is it where they were living when they got elected? So a president could have been born in Delaware, grew up in Pennsylvania, and been elected while living in Illinois. So which state do you count as that president, having that president? So what you got to watch for when you look up presidents and what states they're from is it based on where they were born or where they were elected from, etc. Well, that's the 5 major items from the Hartford Convention that the New England states wanted made into constitutional amendments. Here's a map of the United States, and it shows all these states that have had president or presidents and who the presidents were from those states. So Virginia, you got Washington, Jefferson, Madison, Monroe, Harrison, Tyler, Taylor. Those are all 1800s. And then Woodrow Wilson, who's 110 years ago. So we haven't had a president from this. This map doesn't show Clinton, who's from Arkansas, but that was the 1990s. But in the last 110 years, roughly, there's been 2 more presidents from the South, Carter and Clinton, and Lyndon Johnson, 3 more, sorry. Anyway, interesting stuff. But this was grave concern during the War of 1812, with New England verbally threatening secession, having a convention known as the Hartford Convention, where they suggested constitutional amendments, so on. This is a list of the presidents and the states they're from based on where they were born. You know, you want a copy of this, you can write to me at jb1717@comcast.net, comcast.net. I can send you this list, but look at Abraham Lincoln. He's like the 6th one up from the bottom on the left. Kentucky, you know, we think of Lincoln as being an Illinois guy. That's where he was when he got elected, but he was born in Kentucky. So anytime you see a list of presidents and what states they were from, be sure to ask the question: by birth, by early residence, by present residence, etc. Okay, British strategy for the War of 1812 is the next thing that we're going to look at under the Madison presidency. Well, Britain was at war with France. France had been having a revolution, perfect time to invade a foreign country. Britain's main concern during the War of 1812 was their war with France. In the United States, they went, we just want to be defensive. We're not going to try to take over territory. We're just going to keep them out of our territory. Our real concern is the war we have going on with France, and we want France to become a part of Britain. And, you know, Normandy, which is in France and where the World War II D-Day invasion occurred, that was a part of England back I mean, it was conquered, I think, in the 1500s and made a part of Britain for many years. British kings came out of Normandy in 1066 when it was actually Vikings living in Normandy invaded England in 1066 and took it over. England had Viking presidents for 3 centuries who spoke French. So for 300 years before they started speaking English again at the royal level. And it really wasn't French, even though it was people from Normandy that conquered England. It was really Vikings who had conquered Normandy. So the British are taking a defensive strategy during the War of 1812. Their hope is after a war and the rise of Napoleon that they'll still be able to take over France at some point. And that's what they want to be ready for. So they're just going to set up basically walls in the United States to defend themselves against that war. War of 1812, blockade. Britain blockaded the Atlantic coast, mostly all along the southern states. Here we see Virginia, North and South Carolina, and Georgia. Spain is not part of the U.S. It's owned, Florida, it's owned by Spain. New England is not blockaded. New England was opposed to the war. England knew that they wanted to continue trading, and some trade did indeed continue there, even though it was illegal. The blockade had 3 effects. This British blockade, agricultural exports were basically stopped. Foodstuffs were not getting out. Industries saw their products as being far more important than agricultural ones. So it was agricultural products that suffered the greatest in the lack of trade during the blockade of the War of 1812. Second effect, manufacturing was stimulated in the United States. We had manufacturing. The Industrial Revolution had already occurred in Britain. The United States was growing very slow. Our Industrial Revolution, lots of historians say, really occurred after the Civil War, when we grew like crazy between 1865 and 1900. A book by Jeffrey Williamson, Economic Growth in the Latter Third of the 19th Century, talks about that industrial growth within the United States. So anyway, blockade, second major effect, manufacturing is stimulated. The U.S. had to start making a lot of its own goods, so consequently, more manufacturing places were built, in particular clothing places. And oftentimes they were simply cloth, and you'd go in and buy a part of a roll of cloth, take it home, and you would make the clothing yourself. So much of the U.S. was just simply not involved in any trade at this time. There was a war going on. Third effect of the blockade was the United States didn't have much in the way of a navy, but a gunboat was easy, simple to build, put a couple of guns in it, as you see here, and you set those up at the port cities, and any British ships that get close enough to you, you can shoot at them. It was pretty unsuccessful, however. The Navy was not anything to be, of great concern during this war. So, Madison, we're going to talk about the War of 1812 and raids that occurred. British used hit and run tactics similar to what you see here. This guy gets hit by a car and the car goes speeding off. But what a hit and run tactic in warfare is you move into an area, you stay for a few hours, do as much damage as you can, get back on board your ships and get out of the area. Hit and run. Not a long-term battle where you set up armaments and you dig holes and live in them, and etc. The most common area for attacks is this area that you see here that's in black and blue. It's known as Chesapeake Bay. And you can see that it runs all the way up to Baltimore. At Washington, D.C., the Potomac River runs over to Washington, D.C., and is an outlet to Chesapeake Bay and then to the Atlantic Ocean. So the major attacks that are easy to do by ship for the British occur in Washington, D.C. and in Baltimore, Maryland. In 1814, this is 2 years into the war, a highly successful raid of this type that lasted, I think it was about 3 days, was very successful against Washington, D.C. In retaliation for this attack on Washington, D.C., the U.S. sent troops to attack York, which today, Toronto, Canada area. That was in 1813. So the British saying, okay, they attacked a Canadian city, we're going to attack their capital city. And they did so about a year later. Parliament buildings were burned in Toronto, Canada. So lots of damage was done to the Canadian government. Here are the Parliament buildings on fire, drawing of it. There's no photography yet. This was 28 to 30 April. So you see, it was a 3-day raid into the Canadian capital in 1813 during the War of 1812. During the Washington, D.C. invasion and retaliation, the British burned the White House on 22 August 1814. Lots of Washington, D.C. was on fire. That's basically what the British did, even though they hung around for a while. A little bit more on that in the next couple of slides, but tremendous amount of the territory within Washington, D.C. was set ablaze. And here's a drawing of the White House totally on fire, engulfed. Bill Clinton, he wrote in one of his books that anytime he was having trouble as president, he'd walk out into one of the hallways and look up at a piece of wooden support from the White House before this fire in 1814. And he'd take a look at that wall area of the White House where the wood was burned. And he said, I'd get a lot of relief from the problems I was having when I knew that in 1814 the White House was burned down. Here's a close-up picture of it. You can see the underside is blackened. Madison, we're talking about the military during the War of 1812. There were 3 theaters of war. The first one that we're going to talk about is the Atlantic Ocean. So British had 85 vessels in United States waters, lots of ships. The US had almost nothing, 22, 1/4 the number of ships that Britain had brought to the east coast of the United States. They were blockading US ports, and they were shipping a lot of stuff out of Nova Scotia as a result. So instead of getting things on a ship in the US, they would walk them or put them on horseback and go up into Canada and over to Nova Scotia and could get goods out of the United States that way. It was illegal trade. some US citizens delivering goods up to Nova Scotia and then selling them to the British. So it looked like there was no way the US could win this war. Consequently, they picked battles very carefully. They didn't want losses, which they thought would be exactly what would happen. So they didn't take on these British ships as a group when they were blockading US ports. They'd sit a little further out, and when a ship was coming in and was alone, they could encounter it. So you'd have a single ship-to-ship encounter. Many of these encounters, by the way, interestingly enough, were off the coast of South America, the east coast of South America, because there were a lot more British ships coming individually into that area. So the United States thought, well, we can hurt Britain better and easier if we send a few ships down to the eastern coast of South America and pick off their military vessels there. So a lot of this war, amazingly, when we say one of the three theaters of the war was the Atlantic Ocean, you immediately think of the Atlantic Ocean off the eastern coast of the US. But a lot of it was off the eastern coast of South America. 1,554 British ships in total were claimed by the US. Lots of them were private ships related to industries in Britain. So when we say, Britain had 84 ships blockading US ports, that's a long ways from the total number of military ships and a long, long ways from the corporate ships that the British controlled. Of these 1,554 ships, British ships that were destroyed by the United States, 1,300 of them were captured or destroyed by privateers. And privateers they are pirates, but a pirate isn't associated with any government. Privateers are. You have a license from the government of the United States or the government of Canada or the government of Brazil. We give you a license as a private entity to take your ship or ships and destroy the ships of our enemies. So these were basically private armies for hire. The vast, vast majority of the 1,554 British ships that the US claimed as being captured, 1,300 were by these privateers. They're the same as a pirate, they just have government sanction. Lloyd's of London was the insurance company. It's still in existence today. It was founded in 1688, so it's 330 years ago, roughly, or 40 years ago. It's still in business in 2024. They paid out claims to British ship owners and to the government if the government chose to insure those ships. Generally, they didn't. 1,175 ship losses were covered by Lloyd's of London during the War of 1812. Today, any damage done any place by warfare is not covered by an insurance policy. So, let's say somewhere in the United States, there's like the attack of 9/11 on the World Trade Center. George W. Bush, came on TV soon after that attack. The first words out of his mouth were, "This is an act of war." That freed insurance companies from having to pay any claims for the World Trade Center buildings that were insured, or the other 13 buildings around it that were damaged so bad that they were basically destroyed. So today, insurance companies and insurance policies say, this covers your house unless it's destroyed in an act of war or the damage is the result of warfare. You can buy separate policies. They're very expensive that will cover you during warfare. Most famous battle in the Atlantic Ocean during the War of 1812 was the Gruyere versus the Constitution. It was a ship-to-ship, two-ship battle, and this U.S. Constitution, more famously known as Old Ironsides, is on display. You can go see it on the East Coast there, and that became the most famous ship battle of the War of 1812. A British blockade was very successful. In 1812, first year of the war, we had $130 million, that's about $3 billion today, in trade and exports to other countries. In 1814, when the war was 2 years old and the blockade by Britain of US ports was 2 years old, we were down to $7 million in US exports. That's about $121 million today. 95% loss in 2 years. So that's a tremendous loss in US trade during the War of 1812. New England states, they didn't support the war. They slowly started to regain trade with Britain, even though it would have been illegal at the time. They transferred their ships to other countries. We're no longer registered with the United States. We're now registered with Morocco in North Africa. That's a neutral country in this war. So leave these ships alone. They're the ships of a neutral country, even though they're owned and operated by United States citizens. Today, we see US companies, I mean, they're having things that used to be manufactured in the US, now being manufactured in India or Indonesia or China. So at any rate, it's makes it easier for US corporations. They can be based in the United States, but everything they own, their ships, their manufacturing, all occur elsewhere. A law was passed that any US-based company gets to bring goods in from foreign countries with no fees, no import fees, no tariffs. So a company manufacturing goods in China sails them back to the US and they aren't charged a fee like a Korean based company owned by Koreans would be charged. Tangier Island, it's a little island in Chesapeake Bay, and there were slaves there. And these were all slaves that had escaped from the South into the North. And hopefully they would find British people who would take them in because Britain didn't want slavery. There were several thousand slaves that escaped into British territory. Little side note here, Tangier Island on the left, that's what it looked like in 1850. In 1960, the green, look how it has shrunk in size. These are actual size comparisons. In 2019, there's a significant inland portion of water that's been created in that 60-year period there. But then look at the prediction for 2063. very, very small. The shorelines have been taken over by the ocean. The island is expected to be nothing but wetlands. This is due to global warming, which melts glaciers, polar ice caps, and ends up resulting in higher sea levels. Slaves fought for the British. They escaped to the British. Some in Louisiana, because that was a port city on the Gulf of Mexico. This drawing shows the burning of Washington, D.C. Many slaves aided the British here. And 700 of the slaves were granted land by the British after the war. Several thousand settled in Nova Scotia, Canada, and in Trinidad in the Caribbean Sea, and I've got a map of that. Here's in the lower right, you can see Canada, and on the far right of Canada, red spot, that's Nova Scotia. A lot of these slaves who fought for the British were given land in Nova Scotia. On the upper left is this Nova Scotia area in the cream colored, you can see it's that long, narrow island-like, I mean, surrounded by water on most sides anyway. This is Trinidad Island. If you look on the left image, you can see that at the very bottom left of that map, there's Venezuela. So this Trinidad Island in the Caribbean Sea, where many of these slaves were sent, is just off the coast of the northern section of South America. The map on the right has an arrow pointing to Trinidad and Tobago, these islands, and you can see they're just off the coast of Venezuela there. It was assumed that the British would make land attacks in the United States, especially at Baltimore and Washington, D.C., which they did, but they were very short term. They weren't there for very many days. The Battle of Bladensburg, see here, it's just south and a little bit west of Baltimore, Maryland. U.S. forces were demolished there during a British invasion. Madison went to Virginia. He actually commanded troops when he was president at the Battle of Bladensburg, which was a major defeat for the United States. Washington had commanded troops also. There'd been an uprising of U.S. citizens known as the Whiskey Rebellion. Washington commanded more troops putting down the Whiskey Rebellion, a rising up of U.S. citizens against the U.S. government, than he ever commanded during the American Revolution. A lot of people say this was the true American Revolution. It was people rising up against their leadership. It was not the leaders of Britain fighting the leaders of the United States over economic issues. It wasn't that, so the American Revolution was really two upper classes fighting each other, Britain and the colonies. That's not technically a revolution. So a revolution is people rising up against their own leadership, which is what the Whiskey Rebellion was. Washington, D.C., the White House was conquered. It was in great shape. There was a meal already made there. It had been prepared for James Madison and the staff of the White House and the cabinet, etc., could eat there. And the meal was ready, so British generals sat down and had a meal and then ignited the White House and burned it down. Fortunately, when much of Washington, D.C. was burning, Two tornadoes came into the city, brought with them huge quantities of rain, and the rain doused these fires. If it hadn't been for those tornadoes and the huge rainstorms that came with them, Washington, D.C. would have probably been destroyed virtually in its entirety. The British turned north to Baltimore after doing lots of damage in Washington, D.C. This is where the Battle of Fort McHenry took place in Baltimore Harbor. And British had big guns, the US had little guns. So the British can be further out and not be hurt by, and they can hurt the Americans, but the American shells can't make it as far out as the British are sitting. US guns had short range, British guns had long range. Here's a photograph of Fort McHenry today. You can tour it, site of a very famous battle. National Historic Site today. This is where it was at this battle, observed by Francis Scott Key, that the Star-Spangled Banner was written. And he wrote it as a poem about the battle. It was later put to music, not much later, put to music that already existed. It was not made a national anthem in the United States until 117 years later in 1931, when it became the United States national anthem. Today, Francis Scott Key still remembered for the song, and he will be remembered for a bridge that was named after him and destroyed. I see lawsuits are now being filed against the shipping company that hit the bridge. There are still, I think, 3 bodies that have not been recovered. Total of 6 people dead. Francis Scott Key has a very famous descendant, the novelist Francis Scott Fitzgerald, who grew up here in St. Paul area, best known as F. Scott Fitzgerald. And he lived out in White Bear Lake as an adult for many years at the White Bear Lake Yacht Club, or for many months, but lived out east as an adult mostly. And he is a descendant of Francis Scott Keys. Madison, next theater of war that we're going to talk about is the Great Lakes. There was a British captain named McCargo, interesting name, with cargo in it, because of course that's what ships carry. But this guy was Captain McCargo, and he was in Lake Superior. And he was very worried when the War of 1812 broke out. And he ended up hiding his ship in Isle Royal. And here's where McCargo Cove is located, on that north side of Isle Royal, which is a national park. I've been out there. You can take a ship out, it's a couple hours. And on that southwestern tip is natural resources area. They'll lecture you about it. You can walk. There's huge long walkways in that southern part. Up in the northern part, north of that arrow, even there's hotels you can stay at. But at any rate, for our purposes, McCargo Cove, you can see the arrows pointing to it. Here is a drawing, shows McCargo Cove, and at the bottom of the map is Chicken Bone Lake. Now, this Captain McCargo, British, who wanted to protect his ship, hid out in this cove that eventually was named for him. And he hid out for the entire war there. saving his ship. Hiding place was high walled, spent 3 years in there. So you can see these sedimentary walls that line the inlets into Isle Royal. Here's a book about Captain McCargo and his attempts to save his ship. It's by William Radigan. It's available on Amazon, or was last time I checked. So, little known character, and there's a book about him. Great Lakes, the invasions of Canada. The first invasion was in Detroit. Here's a map of Michigan and some of the Great Lakes, and you can see where Detroit is. That area in red is known as the Niagara Peninsula. And this was a militia group that had been formed. It wasn't an official US Army group that fought the British in this area. Many of the soldiers had resisted service in the US Army during the war, but did join a militia to protect their home territory. Anyway, that's where this battle occurred. There were other invasions, several battles. The US wanted to fight in the West. They didn't want to fight over by the ocean. So you had the Battle of York, which is Toronto today. That's where the Parliament buildings were burned. There were several battles at Stony Creek. Then there was Beaver Dams, Chippewa, Lundy's Landing, Plattsburgh. These were all battle sites along the Great Lakes. Second major invasion, a British general was killed. So that's a big deal. You get a high-ranking person killed. The picture here is Winfield Scott, who was one of the US commanders at these battles on the Great Lakes. A major general, Winfield Scott, he became a general during the Civil War. In 1852, he was a candidate for president, lost to Franklin Pierce. These second invasions along the Canadian coast, there was an attempt, or should have been an attempt to capture Montreal. You'd gain control of all of Quebec probably. The rest of Canada, Montreal was just the center for Eastern Canada, and capturing Montreal, you could have just put to sleep all of that area of Western Canada. The actual US strategy was they wanted to leave the East alone. They wanted war support there to be minimal. They didn't want all those port cities horribly destroyed and then once the war was over, you'd have to rebuild all the shipping. So the United States said, we're going to fight this war in the West, in the territories where damage isn't being done to our infrastructure. So the war was in the West. Montreal was in the East. It was not attacked. Native American battles in the Great Lakes area. US gained control of Lake Erie. There's an arrow pointing to it. And Lake Champlain, it's known as a finger lake. If you look at it there, it's the arrow on the upper right. And you can see it's kind of small, but it's a long, narrow lake. And there's several of those, and they're called Finger Lakes. And they're in New York State. And this is where some of these battles took place. William Henry Harrison, who would become president of the United States, gained notoriety because he was in charge of troops at Indiana Territory. The Battle of Tippecanoe, the arrows pointing to the site of that battle. In 1840, when he ran for president and won, and then died a month into office. His battle cry, not battle cry really, his presidential slogan was Tippecanoe and Tyler too, because he was called Tippecanoe. Tyler was his vice presidential candidate. So he becomes a national hero here. Tecumseh, famous Native American chief, was the opposition at the Battle of Tippecanoe, and he was made a general in the British Army. So he was Shawnee chief whose group had sided with the British. The Battle of Fort Meigs, you can see here, it's on the western end of Lake Erie. U.S. troops were slaughtered big time there. A U.S. officer at that battle let out a Masonic cry. Tecumseh was a Mason, as was this U.S. officer. Tecumseh then stopped the battle because another Mason was in trouble on the enemy's side. Can you believe that? What's more important, your country, your people, or your secret society? Interesting. This has happened several times in warfare all around Europe. Masonic membership transcends national honor in all groups, according to critics. This Masonic order was a major concern during presidential campaigns. Andrew Jackson was a Mason. He ran against John Quincy Adams. John Quincy Adams said, "There's no place in a free society for secret organizations." Jackson said, "Yes, there is." Adams lost that presidential race. Tecumseh was killed in 1813 during the War of 1812. He was 45 years old, and it was at the Battle of Thames. And again, William Henry Harrison was the leader in that battle. Native resistance ended in the Northwest Territories as a result. William Tecumseh Sherman, who was a general for the United States during the Civil War, he did the march through Georgia, cutting the South in half. See, his middle name is for that Indian chief. Oliver Hazard Perry, a naval captain, was at the Battle of Lake Erie, gained control of the lake. His older brother is Matthew Perry, who opened up Japan to trade with the U.S. The Battle of Prairie du Chien in Wisconsin, the British won it. Here's a portion of Wisconsin on that map, that red area that you see. There were U.S. losses. Zachary Taylor was a captain, eventually became a general and president of the United States. And I've been down to this area. You can visit it. It's in Wisconsin. It's Jefferson Davis served there when he was in the United States Army and later became the Confederate president. It's the Fort Crawford Museum. You can go there. Interesting place. Famous people served there, and it was a battle site during the War of 1812. And I'm going to stop so we can do some questions if there are any. And next week, I will start with the third theater of the War of 1812, which is along the southern portion of the Great Lakes. So thank you. And how are we doing?
Hi, we have a couple of questions. Going back to the Hartford Convention, we have a question. How did the provisions of the Hartford Convention resolve itself at the national level in Congress?
Well, none of them were passed as constitutional amendments. You know, the US Congress went, this is a bunch of people that aren't supporting us in this war, and now they want to make amendments that are going to benefit them. So all those 5 proposed amendments of the Hartford Convention were just dead in the water. Yeah, no action.
Okay, we have another question. Wondering, where was New York in terms of support during this time? Were they supporting the New England states, the South? Were they neutral? What was their own relationship with the British?
Well, they were supportive of the war. However, uh, every state in the of the 13 colonies were divided. There were about a third of US citizens that supported England. Why do we want to be rid of England during the American Revolution? And there were about a third that supported independence from Britain, and there were about a third who didn't care. Many of the third who were opposed to the US being in the war left the US and went up to Canada. Now that's back in the 1776 to 83. Now, those same concerns were alive during the War of 1812. So there were lots of people within New York who didn't support the War of 1812, just as they had not supported the American Revolution in the 1770s and 80s. So it varies tremendously, and I don't know exactly what the statistics are for New York. Now, part of New York's concern would be that battles were being fought there in the northern part of New York State. That's where that invasion of Canada occurred, and it's where that Lake Champlain was located. I didn't talk about this, but Lake Champlain had big battles on it, US ships and British ships. And Stephen Decatur was the great name of the naval part of the War of 1812, fighting battles on Lake Champlain. When I talked about Dolley Madison, I showed where she lived there on Lafayette Park, right near the White House. If you walked across Lafayette Park from where she lived, that's where Stephen Decatur lived, was in that house. And he was a leading figure during this War of 1812. But yeah, there was still lots of dissension, especially those 5 New England states. There was lots of dissension about the War of 1812, just as there had been during the American Revolution. So,
Okay. Question, who was in control of, since like we had the Battle of Perdasheen, who was in control of that territory at the time? Was there a governor over the territory? That would be
no, that was a United States fort there.
okay. Just
Yeah, and it was operated and served by soldiers of the United States government.
so just
yeah,
outposts. Okay.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I was just kind of wondering, is like going, who would be having to get things like the thinking about those battles that were happening outside in territories. It's more so that's really where you need to get the financial support, because you're not getting financial support from those territories for the battles that are happening out there.
And you weren't getting financial support from some states, like those New England states. They were refusing to pay for the war because it was affecting their trade with Britain. And this became a big issue after the American Revolution and the War of 1812. Who's going to pay for wars? You know, the federal government finally paid for the American Revolution wars. And anyway, it's you know, the United States wanted these battles in territories, not within the current states itself. That's why we have a battle in Wisconsin and along the southern Great Lakes area. And you know, and there were less troops out there, so I think the attitude was there's less likelihood of great disasters if we fight this war in the West. as opposed to fighting it along the East Coast. The United States did not have much of a navy, 22 ships compared to thousands of ships that the British had, with more than 80 of them off the coast of the US. So why fight where you know you're going to lose? You know, so they made it an internal war, and they could attack Canada, controlled by Britain, from those territories around the Great Lakes. And the Great Lakes offered some protection. You can't just come south. All of a sudden, you got to go all the way around the Great Lakes to get into the United States. And so instead of going straight across the Great Lake, if it was land and it'd be 100 miles, instead you now had you had to march along the shoreline, and it's maybe 400 miles getting to a battle site. So strategically, kind of wise decision by the United States. The decision was, we don't want to be destroyed. We'll fight this war in the West.
Okay, and unrelated to the lecture, except for because it's part of your wardrobe, is where did you get your spooky suspenders?
Oh, I have about 30 pair of suspenders. So when I was working 5 days a week, I could go 6 weeks and not wear the same pair of suspenders. And my students would always say, how many of those things do you have? This class is almost over after 6. I mean, we got 3 weeks left and we haven't seen a duplicate pair of suspenders yet. And they were all very interested in suspenders. And I said, these actually button, they don't clip. So I button them on. If they button on, they're called braces, not suspenders. The ones that clip on are called suspenders. So technically, I'm wearing braces. Now, it was an item of interest back when I was teaching students who were of much younger ages, not the senior citizens of today. So that's over 20 years ago. Now today, I still wear suspenders, but man, do I get horrible comments from young people. I'll be walking through Target and walk past me and say, hey, nice suspenders, mister. Suspenders are seen as something, you know, kind of stupid to wear nowadays.
Oh, don't worry, they'll come back in fashion. And
anyhow, I wear suspenders. These are my Moon and Star suspenders.
so you've had them a while, I'm gonna guess.
I also wore bow ties. So that was a big interest thing. Now I had 60 bow ties. My mother made them all.
Okay.
I started buying bow ties and she said, let me make them. And I said, good, I can't find big ones, wide, you know, they're all real narrow. So she started making them. And I said, holy mackerel, where'd you get this material? And she said, it used to be your sister's shirt.
So,
And anyway, my mother made me a whole bunch of bow ties. I haven't worn bow ties since I retired, you know, 20 some years ago. And I've got them all hanging together in my closet. And I don't know, I could send out a picture of them, I suppose. But anyhow, I was the bow tie and suspender guy.
okay, well, we are just hitting 2 o'clock. And
Okay.
just gonna say thank you, JB, for being willing to turn on a dime and come to the library and work through your technology problems. And glad that we could still get you up and ready to go in time for the class. And I wanted to let people know the past 4 sessions are currently up on the OLLI YouTube channel, and they're also on the Ramsey County Library website under Events and Classes Library Program Videos. So you can view those if you missed anything. And otherwise, we will look forward to all of you joining us again next week, same time, same place, for the last session in the James Madison program. And we want to thank JB so much for sharing your knowledge with us. So, okay, everyone, have a good day.